Hello there. Welcome to Drifting Off Learning Channel. Know that you have arrived somewhere safe, somewhere still, somewhere that asks nothing of you but to simply be. Let your body settle into whatever surface supports you, and feel how that surface rises to meet you, how it accepts the full weight of who you are without complaint or hesitation. You do not need to hold yourself up any longer. You do not need to be ready for anything that might come next. The day has finished with you, and now you may finish with it, releasing each thought and task and responsibility like leaves drifting down from a tree that no longer needs them. Allow your breath to slow, not through effort, but through permission. Let each exhale carry away a small piece of tension, a small piece of the noise that has followed you through your waking hours. And with each inhale, draw in the quiet that surrounds you now, the stillness that has been waiting patiently for you to return to it. Your eyelids may grow heavy, and that is good. Your thoughts may begin to soften at their edges, losing their sharpness and clarity, and that too is good. You are not forgetting anything important. You are simply allowing your mind to rest, as it was always meant to do when the light fades and the world grows hushed. If you find comfort in returning to this channel, to these gentle words spoken in the dark, you are warmly welcome to stay, to subscribe, to make this a place you visit whenever sleep feels distant or difficult. But there is no urgency in that invitation, no expectation. It is simply an open door, left ajar for you, should you ever wish to walk through it again. Now let us turn our attention, softly and without haste, to the gentle subject of silence and quiet places. Those pockets of stillness that exist throughout our world and throughout the universe. Places where sound retreats and peace settles in like dust after a long, still day. These are not dramatic places, not places of spectacle or excitement, but rather places of profound and gentle rest. Places that mirror the quietude you are cultivating now within yourself as you prepare for sleep. There exists in Minnesota, in the northern reaches of the United States, a room that has been called the quietest place on Earth, a chamber designed by scientists to absorb nearly all sound, to create a space where silence becomes almost physical, almost tangible. The walls of this room are lined with thick wedges of sound-absorbing foam, and the floor is a mesh suspended above more foam, and the entire structure floats on springs to isolate it from the vibrations of the building around it. When people enter this room, and the heavy door closes behind them, they find themselves in a silence so complete that they can hear their own heartbeat, their own blood moving through their veins, the quiet creak of their joints and the soft workings of their inner ears. Some find this overwhelming, this absence of the background noise that usually fills our lives, but others find it profoundly peaceful, a reminder of how much silence exists within us, how much quiet we carry in our own bodies, waiting to be noticed. And yet, even in this manufactured silence, there is never truly nothing. Our bodies themselves are instruments of gentle sound, and the silence of the chamber simply allows us to hear them. Your heart, beating now as you rest, makes a sound that accompanies you always, a rhythm so constant and faithful that you have long since stopped noticing it. But it is there, a quiet percussion, a proof of life that asks nothing of your attention. In the deepest silence, we discover that we ourselves are not silent, that life is a subtle music, and that this music continues whether we listen or not. Far from laboratories and scientific chambers, the natural world holds its own sanctuaries of silence, places where the absence of human noise allows a different kind of quiet to exist. The deep forests of old-growth woods, where the trees have stood for centuries, create a kind of silence that is not empty but full of the soft respiration of leaves, the imperceptible creak of growing wood, the patient drip of moisture finding its way from canopy to forest floor. These are not silent places in the absolute sense, but they are quiet in a way that modern life rarely allows. A quietness that permits the mind to slow, to match its rhythm to the unhurried pace of growth and decay that governs all living things. Snow, when it falls thick and soft upon the world, creates one of the most profound natural silences we can experience. Each snowflake is a tiny crystalline structure filled with air, and when millions upon millions of these delicate forms accumulate, they create a layer of extraordinary acoustic absorption. Sound waves enter the snow and become lost in its intricate lattice, unable to bounce back to our ears, and so the world becomes hushed, muffled, wrapped in a blanket of white quietude. If you have ever stepped outside after a heavy snowfall, in those hours before the plows and the traffic return, you may remember how the world seemed to hold its breath, how every sound became softened and near, how the usual chorus of distant noises simply disappeared. This is the silence of transformation, the silence that comes when the familiar is made strange and new. In the deserts of the world, silence takes on a different character. Not the muffled hush of snow, but the vast, open quiet of empty space. The great deserts, the Sahara and the Gobi and the Atacama, are among the quietest places on the surface of the earth. Not because sound is absorbed, but because there is simply so little to make it. The sand and rock stretch to the horizon, and the air is dry and still, and there are no leaves to rustle, no streams to murmur, no insects buzzing in the heat of day. At night, when the temperature drops and the stars emerge in numbers impossible to see from more populated places, the silence of the desert becomes almost cosmic, a silence that feels connected to the silence of space itself, to the vast and ancient quiet that exists between the stars. The ocean, that great and restless body that covers most of our world, holds layers of silence within its depths. Near the surface, where waves break and wind stirs the water, there is constant motion and sound, the crash and hiss and roar of water meeting air. But descend deeper, past the sunlit zones where life teems and moves, and you enter realms of increasing quiet. The deep ocean, miles below the surface, is a place of profound stillness, where the pressure is immense and the light is non-existent, and the sounds of the world above cannot penetrate. Creatures that live in these depths have adapted to this quiet, developing other senses, other ways of navigating a world where sound travels differently, and the usual cues of life are absent. In the abyssal plains, in the trenches that plunge to the very deepest places on earth, silence reigns in a way that predates humanity, that predates all life on land. A silence that has existed for hundreds of millions of years. Space, the great emptiness that begins where our atmosphere ends and stretches outward to infinity, is the ultimate realm of silence. Sound, as we understand it, cannot travel through space, for sound requires a medium, requires molecules of air or water or solid matter to carry its vibrations from one place to another. In the vacuum between worlds, between stars, between galaxies, there is no air and therefore no sound. The universe is, in its essence, silent. The great explosions of stars, the collisions of galaxies, the birth and death of worlds, All of these cosmic events produce no sound that any ear could ever hear. Light and radiation stream outward, but silence accompanies them. When astronauts describe their time in space, they often speak of this silence as one of the most profound aspects of the experience, the absence of the constant background noise of Earth, the absence of wind and traffic and voices, replaced by a quiet so complete that it seems to have weight, to have presence, to be a thing in itself rather than simply the absence of another thing. Closer to home, in the towns and cities where most of us live, there are moments when silence descends, not absolute but relative, not cosmic but human. In the deep hours of the night, in the time between midnight and dawn, even the busiest cities grow quieter. The traffic thins, the shops close, the restaurants empty, and the streets that during the day were rivers of sound become instead quiet corridors, where footsteps echo and the occasional car passes like a distant memory of motion. If you have ever walked through a familiar place at 3 a.m, you know this silence, this sense of the world holding its breath, waiting for the day to return. There is a peace in these hours, a respite from the constant stimulation of modern life, and those who are awake to experience it often speak of it as a gift, a small window of stillness in an otherwise noisy existence. Libraries have long been sanctuaries of quiet, places where silence is not merely present but cultivated, protected, enforced. The great libraries of the world, with their high ceilings and their rows upon rows of books, their thick walls and their carpeted floors, are designed to absorb sound, to create spaces where the mind can focus without the intrusion of external noise. To sit in a reading room in one of these libraries, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, is to experience a silence that feels almost sacred. A silence that invites contemplation, that encourages the slow and careful work of thought. The pages of books themselves are quiet companions, offering their wisdom without sound, communicating through marks on paper rather than through the vibrations of air. Reading is a silent art, a communion between minds that requires no voice, no ear, only the patient movement of eyes across lines of text. There are places in the world where silence is not just present but practiced, where human beings have chosen to cultivate quietude as a spiritual discipline. Monasteries and retreat centers, temples and meditation halls. These are spaces where silence is observed not as an absence but as a presence, not as emptiness but as fullness. The monks of certain Buddhist traditions take vows of silence, speaking only when absolutely necessary, turning their attention instead to the quiet depths of their own minds. The hermits of the Christian tradition, from the Desert Fathers to modern contemplatives, have sought out solitary places where they might encounter the divine in the stillness. What these seekers have discovered, across traditions and across centuries, is that silence is not merely the absence of noise but a field in which other things can grow, subtler things, deeper things, things that the constant chatter of daily life tends to obscure. When we are quiet, when we allow the noise around us to settle and the noise within us to slow, we create space for rest. This is not a complicated truth, not a difficult concept to grasp, but it is one that our noisy world often causes us to forget. Your body knows how to rest, knows how to sink into sleep, knows how to release the tension that has accumulated through the day. But it needs certain conditions to do this work, and one of the most important of those conditions is quiet. The absence of stimulation, the absence of noise, the absence of demands upon your attention. These create the space in which sleep becomes possible. And so, as you lie here now, listening to these gentle words, you are participating in an ancient and natural process. You are preparing your body and your mind for the restorative work of sleep. The quietest hour of the day, in most places, is the hour just before dawn, after the night creatures have finished their activities and before the day creatures have begun. In that hour, if you were to step outside, you would find a stillness that feels almost expectant, a silence that knows it will soon be broken, but that holds itself intact for just a little longer. The birds have not yet started their dawn chorus, the insects are still, the humans are mostly asleep. Even the air itself seems to pause, as if gathering itself for the coming day. This is a sacred hour, an hour that most of us miss because we are, quite rightly, asleep. But an hour that exists nonetheless, a daily return to silence before the world wakes again. Caves, those hollow places within the earth, are natural temples of silence. When you descend into a cave, leaving the entrance and the daylight behind, you enter a world that is entirely cut off from the sounds of the surface. No wind penetrates these depths, no bird song, no rustle of leaves. The rock that surrounds you absorbs and blocks all external sound, and what remains is a silence so profound that it can feel disorienting at first. Your ears, accustomed to the constant low-level noise of the world above, strain to find something to hear and find nothing. But this silence is not threatening, not in the way that darkness can sometimes feel threatening. It is simply still, simply quiet, simply at rest. Caves have been sacred places for humans since the very beginning of our history. Places where the silence invited contemplation, where the absence of distraction allowed the mind to turn inward. The silence of a thick fog is different from other silences, softer and more enveloping. Fog is made of millions of tiny water droplets suspended in the air, and these droplets absorb and scatter sound just as they absorb and scatter light. When fog settles over a landscape, it muffles the usual sounds of the world, creating a strange and dreamy quietude in which distances become uncertain and familiar things seem half erased. Walking through fog is like walking through a cushion, and the silence it brings is similarly cushioned, padded, wrapped in softness. Sounds that do reach your ears seem closer than they should be, more intimate, as if the fog has created a small private space around you, a cocoon of quiet in which only the nearest things can intrude. There is a kind of silence that comes from slowness, from the unhurried pace of things that take a very long time to happen. The growth of a tree, from seed to sapling to towering trunk, unfolds in silence over decades, over centuries. The drift of continents, the rise and fall of mountain ranges, the advance and retreat of glaciers, all of these geological processes occur in a silence that is deeper than any human silence. A silence of deep time, of patience beyond our comprehension. When we contemplate these slow and silent processes, we are reminded of our own smallness, our own brevity, and there is a comfort in this reminder. We do not need to make noise, do not need to announce our presence or prove our importance. We can simply be as the mountains are, as the glaciers are, as the slowly drifting continents are, present and quiet, and part of something much larger than ourselves. The silence between notes in music is as important as the notes themselves. Composers have long understood that sound and silence are partners, that the pauses and rests within a piece of music give shape and meaning to the sounds that surround them. The most famous exploration of this idea may be a composition by John Cage. a piece that consists of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, during which the performers make no deliberate sound. What Cage was suggesting, through this unusual work, is that silence is never truly silent, that even in the absence of intentional music, there is always sound, the sound of the environment, the sound of the audience, the sound of one's own body and breath. But there is also, in this piece, an invitation to listen differently, to pay attention to the quiet sounds we usually ignore, to find music in the ambient noise of existence. In Japan, there is a tradition of gardens designed for contemplation, gardens that cultivate quietude as carefully as they cultivate plants. These gardens, with their carefully raked gravel and their precisely placed stones, their mosses and their ponds, are meant to be spaces of stillness, spaces where the noise of the world falls away and the mind can settle into a state of peaceful attention. The famous rock gardens of Kyoto, with their abstract arrangements of stone against smooth white sand, create a silence that is visual as well as auditory, a silence of simplicity, of restraint, of things reduced to their essence. To sit beside such a garden, to let your gaze rest upon its careful arrangements, is to experience a quiet that seeps into you, that slows your thoughts and calms your breath. The silence of empty rooms has a particular quality, a sense of potential, of space waiting to be filled. When you enter a room where no one has been for a while, you can sometimes sense the quiet that has accumulated there, the stillness that has settled into the corners and the dust that has gathered on the surfaces. This is not a lonely silence, but a patient one. A silence that knows that rooms are meant to be inhabited, that people will return, that the quiet will eventually be broken. There is something restful about empty rooms, something that invites you to pause, to simply be present in the space without needing to do anything, or say anything, or think anything in particular. The practice of meditation is, among other things, a practice of cultivating internal silence. When we sit in meditation, we are not trying to stop our thoughts entirely, not trying to create a vacuum within the mind. We are instead learning to quiet the constant commentary that usually runs through our consciousness, to create a little more space between one thought and the next. This internal silence is not easy to achieve, especially for those of us who have spent our lives in noisy environments, surrounded by stimulation and distraction. But with practice, with patience, the mind can learn to settle, can learn to rest in quietude, even as thoughts continue to arise and pass away. This inner silence is perhaps the most profound kind of quiet we can experience, for it is a silence we carry with us wherever we go, a silence that is not dependent on external conditions. There are animals that have evolved to be particularly quiet, creatures whose survival depends on making as little noise as possible. Owls are perhaps the most famous of these silent hunters, their wings fringed with soft feathers that break up the sound of air flowing over them, allowing them to fly in near total silence. When an owl descends upon its prey, there is no warning, no rush of sound to alert the mouse or vole to danger. This silence is a kind of mastery, a refinement over millions of years of evolution, and it is also, in its way, beautiful. The owl moves through the night like a thought, like a shadow, making no more noise than the darkness itself. In the Arctic and Antarctic regions, silence takes on the quality of the ice and snow that dominate the landscape. The great ice sheets, miles thick in places, are among the quietest environments on Earth. There is little life here to make sound, and what life exists is often still, conserving energy against the cold. The wind can howl across these frozen plains, but when the wind is calm, The silence is absolute. A silence that seems to have been here since the beginning of time. A silence that will be here long after human ears have ceased to exist. Explorers who have traveled to these regions often speak of the silence as one of the most striking aspects of the experience. A silence that makes the mind feel very small and very still. The quiet of a sleeping house, with all its inhabitants at rest, is a special kind of silence, warm and inhabited. This is not the cold silence of empty spaces, but the living silence of bodies at peace, of dreams unfolding in the darkness. The creaks and settlings of the house itself, the distant hum of appliances, the soft sounds of breathing. These are part of the silence rather than intrusions upon it. If you have ever been awake while others sleep, moving quietly through the house, you know this silence, this sense of being the sole witness to a communal rest. There is a tenderness in this silence, a feeling of being among those who are vulnerable and trusting, of being a guardian of their sleep. The natural quiet of certain landscapes can be so profound that it affects the way we perceive time. In very quiet places, time seems to slow, to stretch, to become less insistent. This may be because so much of our sense of time passing is tied to activity, to events, to changes in our environment. When nothing is happening, when no sounds mark the passage of seconds and minutes, time loses its usual landmarks, and we are left in a kind of eternal present. This can be disorienting for those unaccustomed to it, but it can also be deeply restful, a release from the constant forward pressure of time that characterizes modern life. When we close our eyes, we create a kind of silence for our visual sense, a cessation of the constant stream of images that usually floods our awareness. Closing your eyes is a way of turning down the volume of the world, of reducing the stimulation that demands your attention. And when you add to this visual silence an auditory quiet, an absence of demanding sounds, you create conditions in which the mind can truly rest. This is why we close our eyes to sleep, why we seek out dark and quiet places for rest. Your eyes are closed now or growing heavy, and the sounds around you are soft, and you are approaching that state of peaceful stillness that is the gateway to sleep. There is a quiet that comes with distance, with seeing things from very far away. When you look at a mountain from across a great valley, you see it in silence. The streams that cascade down its slopes, the wind that moves through the trees on its flanks, the animals that live upon its surface. All of these are making sounds that do not reach your ears. The mountain exists in a kind of visual silence, a stillness that is an artifact of distance. And when we look up at the stars, we are seeing an even more profound kind of distance, light that has traveled for years or centuries or millennia to reach our eyes. Light from sources that are utterly silent to us, unreachable by any sound we could ever make or hear. The murmur of distant water, a stream or river or the ocean heard from far away, is sometimes called the edge of silence. It is there, but barely, a whisper of sound that hovers at the threshold of perception. This kind of soft, continuous sound can actually enhance our sense of quiet rather than disrupting it, creating a gentle background that masks other, more intrusive noises. This is why many people find the sound of moving water restful, why fountains are placed in gardens meant for contemplation, why the distant sound of the sea is often described as peaceful. There is a border region between sound and silence, and the gentle murmur of water exists in that region, neither fully silent nor truly noisy. The inside of a seashell, held to the ear, produces what many people experience as a kind of oceanic hush. This sound is not actually the sea, of course, but rather the ambient noise of the environment being resonated and amplified by the shell's curved interior. And yet, there is something deeply peaceful about this illusion, something that connects us to the vast quiet of the ocean, even when we are far from any shore. The shell becomes a small, portable silence, a pocket of hush that we can carry with us and access whenever we wish. It is a reminder that quiet can be found in unexpected places, in small containers as well as vast landscapes. There is a silence that belongs to very old things, to objects that have existed for so long that they seem to have absorbed the quiet of centuries. An ancient stone, a fossil, a piece of driftwood worn smooth by decades of water. These things carry a stillness with them, a sense of having witnessed so much and having remained unchanged through it all. When we hold such objects, we are holding condensed time, and the silence of that time seems to radiate from them. Museums are full of such objects, arranged in quiet rooms where visitors move slowly and speak in hushed voices, as if the silence of the artifacts demands a corresponding silence from those who come to see them. The silence of night in the countryside is different from the silence of night in the city. In the countryside, the absence of artificial noise allows natural sounds to emerge. The calls of owls, and the chirping of crickets, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. But even these sounds are quiet compared to the roar of traffic and industry, and they blend together into a kind of living silence, a backdrop of gentle noise that feels more restful than disturbing. Many people who have grown up in cities find this natural quiet unsettling at first, too still, too empty. But given time, the ear adjusts, and what once felt like an absence becomes instead a presence, a comforting fullness of gentle, natural sound. There's a type of chamber called a reverberation room, designed not to absorb sound but to reflect it, to keep sound alive in the space for as long as possible. These rooms are used by scientists and engineers to test how materials respond to noise, but they also demonstrate something interesting about silence. In a highly reverberant space, even a small sound can persist for many seconds, echoing and re-echoing from the hard surfaces. When the sound finally dies away, the silence that follows feels especially profound, a contrast made starker by what came before. This is the silence of aftermath, the quiet that settles in when activity has ceased, and it has a particular quality of resolution, of things coming to rest. The bottom of the ocean, in the deepest trenches, is among the most silent places on the planet. At depths of 7 miles or more, the water is cold and still and utterly dark, and the pressure is so great that sound behaves differently than it does near the surface. The creatures that live in these depths move slowly and quietly, their bodies adapted to a world where energy is scarce and every motion must be efficient. Scientists who have sent recording equipment to these depths have captured very little sound, just the occasional groan of the Earth's crust or the distant rumble of underwater earthquakes. It is a realm of profound stillness, a place where silence has reigned for billions of years, undisturbed by the noise of the world above. The concept of acoustic ecology emerged in the late 20th century as a way of thinking about the soundscapes that surround us and the effects they have on our well-being. Researchers in this field have documented the ways in which natural quiet is disappearing from the world, replaced by the constant hum of machinery and traffic and industry. They have also studied the benefits of natural quiet, finding that exposure to peaceful soundscapes can reduce stress, lower blood pressure, and promote healing. This research confirms what many people intuitively know, that silence and natural quiet are not luxuries, but necessities, fundamental to our physical and mental health. There are sounds so low in frequency that they fall below the range of human hearing, and these are called infrasound. Many natural phenomena produce infrasound, including earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and ocean waves, but we cannot hear these sounds directly. They exist in a kind of auditory silence for us, a realm of vibration that our ears cannot detect. Some researchers believe that we can still perceive infrasound in other ways, as feelings of unease or awe or presence, even when we are not consciously aware of any sound. The silence of our perception, in other words, may not be complete. There may be sounds all around us that we experience not as sound, but as something else, as mood, as atmosphere, as the ineffable quality of a place. High in the mountains, above the tree line, there is a silence that feels almost extraterrestrial. The air is thin, and sound does not carry as well as it does at lower elevations. The rock and ice and snow absorb what sound there is, and the wind, when it blows, seems to pass through rather than around you. Climbers who have reached the highest peaks often speak of the silence as one of the most memorable aspects of the experience. A quiet so profound that it seems to merge with the vast emptiness of the sky above. This is the silence of altitude, of remoteness, of being so far from the noise of human civilization that it might as well not exist. The phenomenon of tinnitus, the perception of sound in the absence of external stimulus, reveals something interesting about our relationship with silence. For people who experience tinnitus, true silence is impossible, for there is always a ringing or buzzing or hissing present, generated not by the outside world, but by the auditory system itself. This can be distressing, a constant intrusion that makes rest difficult, but it also reminds us that silence is not merely the absence of external sound. It is a complex phenomenon that depends on the state of our own bodies and minds. The silence we experience when we are at peace is different from the silence we experience when we are anxious or unwell. Silence, like so much else, is shaped by who we are and how we are feeling. There are trees that have been standing for thousands of years, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations in silence. The bristlecone pines of the American Southwest, some of which are nearly 5,000 years old, have grown slowly and quietly through millennia of human history. They were old when the pyramids were built, old when Rome was founded, old when the great migrations of peoples reshaped the continents. And through all of this, they have remained silent, their rings recording the passage of time in a language that requires no sound. To stand beside such a tree is to stand beside a witness to deep time, a living creature that has known silence longer than any human society has existed. The experience of solitary confinement, imposed as punishment in some prison systems, reveals the dark side of silence and isolation. When deprived of all sound and human contact for extended periods, the mind can suffer greatly, producing hallucinations, anxiety, and lasting psychological damage. This extreme demonstrates that while silence can be restful and healing in the right circumstances, it can also be harmful when imposed without consent or connection. The silence we seek for sleep is not the silence of deprivation, but the silence of peace. Not the silence of isolation, but the silence of safety. The difference lies in choice, in comfort, in the knowledge that the quiet is a gift we give ourselves rather than a burden placed upon us. The vacuum of space, though silent in the conventional sense, is not entirely without vibration. Gravitational waves, ripples in the fabric of space-time itself, pass through the cosmos, generated by the most violent events in the universe. The collisions of black holes, the explosions of neutron stars. These waves cannot be heard, for they are not sound, but they can be detected by exquisitely sensitive instruments on Earth, and they tell us something about the silence of space. It is not a dead silence, not an empty stillness, but a silence that contains within it the traces of unimaginable events, vibrations that have traveled for billions of years to reach us. The universe is speaking, in a sense, but in a language we are only beginning to learn to hear. When an orchestra pauses before the final chord of a symphony, the silence in the concert hall becomes electric, charged with anticipation. Every member of the audience holds their breath, waiting for the resolution that they know is coming. This is performative silence, silence that is part of the art, that has been composed and rehearsed just as carefully as the notes themselves. It reminds us that silence is not merely background, not merely the absence of music. It is an instrument in its own right, capable of producing its own effects, its own emotions. The conductor who understands this uses silence as skillfully as any violinist uses their bow, shaping the pauses to heighten the impact of what comes after. In the early morning, before the sun has risen, there is a time when the world seems suspended between night and day. The darkness is beginning to lift, but the light has not yet come, and in this in-between time, a particular kind of silence prevails. It is the silence of transition, of ending and beginning, of one state giving way to another. If you have ever been awake at this hour, perhaps unable to sleep or perhaps choosing to rise early, you may have felt this silence as a kind of magic, a brief window when anything seems possible. The birds have not yet begun their dawn chorus, the traffic has not yet resumed, and the world is yours alone, quiet and waiting. The silence of falling snow is different from the silence of lying snow. As snowflakes descend, they create a kind of visual silence, a softening of edges and a muffling of color that makes the world seem quieter, even before the snow has accumulated enough to absorb sound. There is something hypnotic about watching snow fall, a stillness in the motion that seems paradoxical but feels deeply true. Each flake follows its own path, guided by currents of air invisible to us, and together they create a curtain of quiet that draws across the landscape like a stage curtain, signaling the end of one act and the beginning of another. There is a silence that belongs to the very small, to the realm of atoms and molecules and quantum particles. At this scale, the concept of sound, as we understand it, ceases to apply, for there are no ears to hear and no air to carry vibrations. The quantum world operates according to its own rules, rules that are strange and counterintuitive to our everyday understanding. Particles exist in multiple states at once, move through barriers that should be impenetrable, and influence each other instantaneously across vast distances. All of this happens in silence, in a realm where the very idea of sound is meaningless. And yet, from this silent foundation, all the noise of the universe emerges, all the sounds that fill our lives built up from the silent interactions of particles too small to see. The silence of an empty church or temple, when no service is being held and no worshipers are present, has a quality that many people find profoundly moving. The architecture of sacred spaces is often designed to enhance this silence, with high ceilings that allow sound to dissipate, thick walls that block external noise, and materials that absorb rather than reflect. Stepping into such a space, out of the bustle of the street and into this cultivated quiet, can feel like stepping out of time itself, into a realm where the concerns of daily life are momentarily suspended. Whether or not one holds religious beliefs, the silence of sacred spaces speaks to something deep in the human psyche, a longing for peace that transcends culture and creed. There are frequencies of sound so high that they pass beyond our ability to hear them, and these are called ultrasound. Bats navigate using ultrasound, sending out high-pitched calls and listening for the echoes that return, building a picture of their environment from sound alone. Dogs can hear frequencies higher than humans can, which is why dog whistles seem silent to us but not to them. The world is full of sounds that we cannot perceive, a symphony of vibrations that surrounds us constantly but never reaches our consciousness. In this sense, we live in a kind of partial silence, aware of only a narrow band of the acoustic spectrum, deaf to the vast majority of sounds that exist. This is a humbling thought, a reminder that our experience of the world is shaped by the limitations of our senses, that reality contains far more than we can ever perceive. The stillness of a lake on a windless morning, when the water is so calm that it becomes a perfect mirror, is accompanied by a particular kind of silence. The absence of wind means the absence of waves, and the absence of waves means the absence of the gentle lapping and splashing that usually accompanies bodies of water. In these moments, the lake becomes almost abstract, a surface of pure reflection that seems to belong more to the realm of ideas than to the physical world. Fish may be moving beneath the surface. Birds may be watching from the shore, but all of this happens in silence, or near silence, a hush that makes every small sound, the call of a loon, the splash of a rising fish, seem significant and precious. The moon, our nearest celestial neighbor, is a place of absolute silence. It has no atmosphere, no medium through which sound can travel, and so the footsteps of the astronauts who walked upon its surface made no sound that anyone could hear. They moved through a world of utter quiet, their voices reaching each other only through the radios in their helmets. The photographs they brought back show a landscape of stark beauty, gray and white and black, mountains and craters and plains under a sky of absolute darkness. And all of this exists in silence, has always existed in silence, will continue to exist in silence long after the footprints of those astronauts have been erased by the slow rain of micrometeorites that falls upon the lunar surface. There is a silence that comes with the ending of things, with the final breath of a life, with the last page of a book, with the closing of a door that will not open again. This is not a peaceful silence, not always, but it is a profound one, a silence that marks a transition from being to not being, from presence to absence. We encounter this silence at funerals, in hospitals, at the end of relationships and the conclusion of eras. It is a silence that asks us to pause, to acknowledge what has passed, to make space in our lives for loss. And while this silence can be painful, it can also be meaningful, a necessary part of the rhythm of existence, of the cycle of beginnings and endings that governs all things. In the depths of caves, beyond the reach of any sunlight, there are chambers that have not seen a living creature for tens of thousands of years. The stalactites and stalagmites continue their slow growth, mineral-laden water dripping in utter darkness, building formations of extraordinary beauty that no human eye may ever see. The silence in these places is unbroken, has been unbroken for longer than our species has existed, may remain unbroken for longer still. This is the silence of geological time, of processes so slow that they make a mockery of human impatience. The earth goes about its business in these hidden places, shaping stone and building crystals, all in perfect primordial quiet. The quietest animals are often those who depend on stealth for survival. Prey animals move silently to avoid detection by predators, while predators move silently to avoid alerting their prey. The cat, whether domestic or wild, is a master of silent movement, placing each paw with care, shifting its weight gradually, flowing through space without a sound. This silence is a form of communication, or rather, a form of non-communication, a way of existing in the world without announcing one's presence. We can learn from these animals, can practice our own forms of silent movement, our own ways of being present without demanding attention. There's a kind of power in silence, a kind of grace that noise can never achieve. The practice of silent reading, which we now take for granted, was not always common. In the ancient world, reading was typically done aloud, the voice serving as the bridge between the written word and the understanding. It was not until later centuries that silent reading became the norm, that people began to experience text as an interior voice rather than an exterior sound. This shift changed the relationship between reader and book, making reading a more private and contemplative activity, a silent conversation between the mind and the page. Today, when we read, we enter a kind of silence, a withdrawal from the auditory world into a realm of pure meaning, where words transmit their content without passing through the medium of sound. There are silences that feel like gifts, offered freely and without expectation of return. The silence of a friend who simply sits with you when you are troubled, not offering advice or solutions but simply being present, is one such gift. The silence of a landscape that asks nothing of you, that does not judge or evaluate, that simply is another. These silences are forms of acceptance, ways of being together or being present that do not require words. They are reminders that not everything needs to be said, that sometimes the most profound connections are those that exist beyond language, in the shared quiet of mutual understanding. The phenomenon of the noise floor, familiar to audio engineers and musicians, refers to the baseline level of noise present in any recording environment. No matter how quiet a space seems, there is always some level of ambient sound, some hiss or hum or rumble that underlies everything else. Reducing the noise floor is a constant challenge in recording, requiring careful attention to equipment, room design, and electrical interference. But the noise floor also exists in nature, in the ambient sounds that are always present, the distant traffic, the HVAC systems, the wind, the rustle of leaves. True silence, in the sense of absolute zero noise, may be impossible to achieve anywhere on Earth. What we call silence is always, in truth, a relative term, a reduction rather than an elimination of sound. The experience of floating in sensory deprivation tanks, sometimes called isolation tanks or float tanks, offers a taste of profound silence. These tanks are filled with water saturated with Epsom salt, allowing the body to float effortlessly at the surface. The water is heated to skin temperature, so that the boundary between body and environment becomes indistinct. The tank is enclosed and darkened, eliminating light, and the water blocks much of the sound that would otherwise reach the ears. In this environment, people report experiences of deep relaxation, of meditation-like states, of the mind finally quieting its constant chatter. The silence of the float tank is not merely auditory but sensory, a reduction of all stimulation that allows the nervous system to rest in a way that is rarely possible in ordinary life. There is a type of architectural design called acoustic design, which takes into consideration the ways sound moves through spaces and seeks to shape those movements for particular purposes. Concert halls are designed to enhance music, projecting it clearly to every seat while avoiding harsh echoes or dead spots. Offices are designed to reduce distraction, absorbing the sounds of conversations and keyboard clicks that might otherwise accumulate into an unbearable din. Hospitals are designed to promote healing, with quiet zones where patients can rest without being disturbed. This attention to sound and silence is relatively recent in the history of architecture, but it reflects an ancient understanding that the sonic environment of a space profoundly affects how we feel and function within it. The silence of a written letter arriving through the mail is different from the silence of an email or a text message. The letter has traveled through physical space to reach you, carried by hands and vehicles, stamped and sorted and delivered. When you open the envelope and unfold the paper, you are holding something that the sender also held, a tangible connection across distance and time. Reading the letter, you hear the sender's voice in your mind, but only in your mind. The paper is silent. The ink is silent, and yet communication occurs, meaning passes from one person to another without a single sound being made. This is the magic of writing, the technology that allowed human thought to transcend the limitations of time and space, all in perfect silence. Deep in the ocean, in the region known as the SOFAR channel, sound can travel extraordinary distances. This layer of water, at a depth of about 1,000 meters, has particular properties of temperature and pressure that cause sound waves to become trapped, bouncing back and forth as they travel, unable to escape upward or downward. A sound made in the SOFAR channel can theoretically travel across entire ocean basins, from one side of the Pacific to the other. Scientists have used this phenomenon to study the ocean and to track the movements of whales, who seem to make use of the channel for their own long-distance communications. But for most of the ocean, most of the time, this deep layer is silent, a highway of potential sound that remains unused, waiting. The quiet of a garden in the evening, as the light fades and the colors deepen, is a particular kind of peaceful. The activity of the day has wound down. The gardening tools have been put away, and the plants stand still in the cooling air. If you sit in a garden at this hour, you may notice sounds you missed during the brighter hours. The buzz of a late bee returning to its hive, the chirp of a cricket beginning its nighttime song, the distant bark of a dog settling in for the evening. These sounds do not disturb the quiet, but rather constitute it, forming a backdrop of gentle noise that feels restful rather than intrusive. The garden does not demand anything of you at this hour. It simply is, growing and resting in its own time, indifferent to human concerns. There is a silence that comes with understanding, with the moment when a difficult concept finally clicks into place and the mind rests in the satisfaction of knowing. This is not an auditory silence, of course, but it feels like one, a cessation of the mental noise that accompanies confusion and struggle. The mind, having found what it was looking for, quiets down, stops its restless searching, and settles into a kind of peace. This silence of understanding is one of the great pleasures of learning, a reward that comes after effort, a stillness that follows activity. It reminds us that the mind, like the body, needs rest, and that true understanding brings its own form of quiet. The marshes and wetlands of the world, with their reeds and rushes and still water, are places of hushed and muffled sound. The dense vegetation absorbs noise, and the water reflects it in strange ways, creating an acoustic environment that feels muted and dreamlike. Walking through a marsh, you may hear the plop of a frog entering the water, the rustle of a bird in the reeds, the distant call of a heron. But all of these sounds seem softened, gentled by the landscape itself. The marsh is a transitional place, neither fully land nor fully water, and its silence too is transitional. Neither complete quiet nor ordinary noise, but something in between, something uniquely its own. There is a phenomenon that occurs in certain valleys and bowls shaped by geography, where sound is focused and amplified by the curvature of the land. These are sometimes called acoustic valleys or whispering galleries, and they demonstrate that sound can behave in unexpected ways depending on the shape of the environment. A whisper made at one point in such a space can be clearly heard at another point far away, as if the sound has been carried by invisible hands. These places remind us that silence and sound are not simple phenomena, but complex interactions between vibration and space, between the source of sound and the environment through which it travels. What seems quiet in one location may be amplified in another, and vice versa, all depending on the architecture of the world. The invention of the phonograph in the late 19th century changed humanity's relationship with sound and silence forever. For the first time, sounds could be captured and preserved, played back at will, made to persist beyond the moment of their creation. This meant that silence could now be deliberately broken with the sounds of the past, that a voice could speak even when its owner was no longer present, that music could fill a room without musicians. In the years since, recording technology has become so ubiquitous that we rarely think about how strange and miraculous it is. We carry entire libraries of sound in our pockets, ready to banish silence at a moment's notice. And yet, despite this abundance of recorded sound, silence remains valuable, perhaps more valuable than ever. A scarce resource in a world that has learned to fill every moment with noise. The aurora borealis, those shimmering curtains of light that dance across the polar skies, occur in near total silence. There are some reports of people hearing the aurora, faint crackling or hissing sounds that accompany the visual display. But these accounts are controversial and not fully understood. For most observers, the aurora is a silent phenomenon, light without sound, beauty without noise. This silence adds to the otherworldly quality of the experience, the sense that one is witnessing something not quite of this earth, something that belongs to a different realm where the usual rules of cause and effect do not apply. The lights move and shift and change, but they do so quietly, like ghosts, like dreams made visible in the night sky. In the tradition of many indigenous peoples, silence is valued as a way of being in the world, not a void to be filled, but a presence to be respected. Many Native American cultures, for instance, practice what might be called respectful silence, a way of listening and waiting that allows space for others to speak, for events to unfold, for wisdom to emerge. This is not the uncomfortable silence of social awkwardness, but a companionable quiet, a shared space of presence that does not require words. Such traditions offer an alternative to the modern tendency to fill every moment with speech and noise, suggesting that there are other ways of being together, other ways of communicating that do not depend on sound. The phenomenon of residual sound, the way a room continues to resonate after a sound has been made, reveals something about the nature of silence. When a door slams or a bell rings, the sound does not simply stop. It dies away gradually, its energy absorbed by the surfaces of the room, until it fades below the threshold of perception. In this dying away, in this gradual return to silence, there is a transition zone, a period when the sound is no longer fully present, but not yet fully absent. Paying attention to this transition can be a meditative practice, a way of becoming more aware of the subtle gradations between sound and silence, of the way one state flows into another. The depths of the earth, far below the surface where we live, are realms of profound and lasting silence. In the deep mines that descend miles into the crust, miners work in an environment that is cut off from the sounds of the surface, insulated by layers of rock from the noise of wind and weather and human activity. The sounds they hear are the sounds they make themselves, the clang of tools and the rumble of machinery, sounds that feel strange and isolated in the vast silence that surrounds them. Deeper still, in the mantle and core of the earth, there is no sound at all, only the slow movement of molten rock, the gradual convection that drives the drifting of continents, processes too slow and too massive to be perceived as sound. The silence between two people who know each other well can be one of the most comfortable silences of all. When words are not needed, when the simple presence of another person is enough, the silence becomes a kind of communication, a shared understanding that transcends language. Couples who have been together for many years often develop this capacity for comfortable silence, sitting together without speaking, reading or thinking or simply being, connected without the need for words. This is the silence of intimacy, of familiarity, of trust. It is a silence that takes time to develop, time and patience and the willingness to let go of the need to fill every moment with speech. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a live performance, the moment after the last note has faded, but before the applause begins. In this moment, the audience is suspended between worlds, between the transported state the performance has created and the ordinary reality to which they must return. The silence is part of the performance, as integral as any note or word, and skilled performers know how to use it, how to hold the audience in that suspended state for just the right amount of time before releasing them back into the world of noise and speech and applause. This is performative silence at its most powerful. Silence as an artistic tool, silence that moves and transforms. The silence of old photographs, images captured before the invention of motion pictures and sound recording, is poignant in a particular way. We see the faces of people long dead, caught in a moment of time, but we cannot hear their voices, cannot know what they sounded like, what language they spoke, what songs they sang. Their silence is the silence of the past itself, the vast realm of human experience that exists now only in traces and fragments. Every generation before our own lived and died in a world that could not preserve their sounds, and so they passed into silence, leaving behind only what could be captured in writing and still images. This is a reminder of how much is always being lost, how much silence the past contains. In space, the silence is so complete that it poses challenges for the human psyche. Astronauts in orbit report missing the small ambient sounds of Earth, the wind, the rain, the distant hum of life and activity that we usually do not even notice. Space agencies have experimented with adding artificial soundscapes to spacecraft, hoping to ease this silence-related stress. The sounds of nature, of water and birdsong and rustling leaves are played through speakers, a simulation of Earth's ambient noise designed to keep astronauts grounded, to remind them of the home they have temporarily left behind. This is perhaps the strangest tribute to the importance of sound in human life, the deliberate creation of noise to combat the overwhelming silence of space. The silence of early morning in a city, in that brief window between the last late-night revelers and the first early morning commuters, is a particular kind of urban quiet. The streets that were full of noise just hours ago are now almost empty, and the silence feels earned, the reward for having outlasted the noise of the night. In these hours, the city belongs to a different population, to the night shift workers heading home, to the bakery staff starting their ovens, to the delivery trucks restocking the shelves. There is a camaraderie among those who inhabit this pre-dawn silence, a shared appreciation for this brief window of quiet before the city wakes and roars back into life. There are sounds that exist at the very edge of perception, sounds so quiet that it is difficult to say whether we are hearing them or imagining them. The settling of a house, the distant throb of a heartbeat, the movement of air through small spaces. These are sounds that hover at the threshold of consciousness, sometimes noticed and sometimes not. Paying attention to these marginal sounds can be a way of deepening our awareness of the present moment, of becoming more attuned to the subtle textures of experience. At the same time, it can be a way of appreciating silence more fully, of understanding that silence is never absolute, that there is always more to hear if we are willing to listen. The silence of freshly fallen snow has inspired poets and writers for centuries. There is something about this particular quiet that speaks to the human heart, that evokes feelings of peace and stillness and the possibility of renewal. Perhaps it is the visual transformation that accompanies the auditory one, the way the snow covers and softens everything, hiding the ordinary world beneath a blanket of white. Perhaps it is the rarity of the experience, at least for those who live in temperate climates, the sense that this quiet is a special gift, a temporary respite from the usual noise of life. Whatever the reason, the silence of snow continues to captivate us, to call us out of our warm houses to stand in the hush and wonder. There is a tradition in some cultures of observing a minute of silence to honor the dead or to mark significant events. During this minute, the normal noise of life is deliberately suspended, and people stand still and quiet, united in their attention to something beyond the everyday. This collective silence is a powerful form of ritual, a way of creating sacred time within ordinary time, of stepping out of the stream of life to acknowledge what is important. The silence of a large group of people all standing still together has a weight and presence that individual silence does not. A sense of shared attention, of communal respect, of something larger than any single person. The absence of sound in outer space means that the great events of the cosmos unfold in silence. When a star explodes, when two neutron stars collide, when matter spirals into a black hole, there is no sound, no roar, no thunder. The energy of these events takes other forms, light and radiation and gravitational waves, but not the vibrations of air that our ears are designed to detect. This cosmic silence is almost impossible for us to truly comprehend. So accustomed are we to the sounds of our world. We imagine space battles with the roar of engines and the boom of explosions. But in reality, space is silent, and any beings that venture into it carry their sounds with them, encased in the bubbles of air they bring from home. The quiet of a winter forest, with snow on the ground and the trees bare of leaves, has a spare beauty that is unlike any other season. In summer, the forest is full of sound, birdsong and insect buzz, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But in winter, especially after a snowfall, the forest falls quiet, its inhabitants asleep or hiding, its sounds muffled by the snow. Walking through such a forest is like walking through a cathedral, the tall trunks standing like columns, the silence like a benediction. Your footsteps crunch in the snow, and the sound seems to echo in the stillness, reminding you of your own presence in this quiet place. There is a phenomenon known as room tone, familiar to anyone who has worked in audio production. This is the ambient sound of a room when no one is speaking and no activity is occurring. The hum of air conditioning, the distant rumble of traffic, the subtle sounds of the building itself. When recording dialogue or sound effects, audio engineers capture room tone separately so that they can fill in gaps in the audio without creating jarring silences. This attention to room tone reveals how rarely we experience true silence, how even spaces that seem quiet have their own acoustic signature, their own subtle soundtrack that we usually do not consciously notice. The silence of ruins, of ancient buildings that have fallen into decay, is haunted by the sounds that once filled them. Walking through the remains of a Roman forum or a medieval castle, you can almost imagine the voices and footsteps that once echoed there, the daily life that animated these now silent stones. The silence is not empty but full of ghosts, full of the memory of sounds that have long since faded. This is the silence of time, of the past asserting its presence in the present, of the reminder that everything we build and everything we are will someday fall silent too. There is a type of listening called deep listening, developed by composer Pauline Oliveros, that involves paying attention not only to sounds but to the silence between and around them. This practice is both musical and meditative, a way of becoming more fully present to the auditory world, of hearing what we usually ignore. Deep listening asks us to notice the quietest sounds, the sounds at the edge of perception, and also to notice the quality of the silence that surrounds all sound. In this practice, silence is not merely the absence of sound, but an active presence, a field against which sound emerges and into which it dissolves. The quietest time in many ecosystems comes not at night, as we might expect, but in the hot hours of the early afternoon. In tropical forests, in deserts, in savannas, the midday heat drives many animals to seek shade and rest, and the chorus of morning birdsong gives way to a kind of siesta silence. The air shimmers with heat, and nothing moves that does not have to. This is the silence of conservation, of energy preserved against the extremity of temperature, a daily pause in the activity of life. When the heat begins to fade and the shadows lengthen, the sounds return, animals emerging from their rest to resume the business of living. There is a tradition in many spiritual paths of the silent retreat, a period of days or weeks during which practitioners refrain from speech and minimize other noise. These retreats are designed to create conditions for deep inner work, for the quieting of the mind that is so difficult to achieve in ordinary life. Participants often report that the experience is transformative, that the extended silence allows them to see themselves and their lives more clearly, to let go of patterns and habits that no longer serve them. The silence of the retreat is not imposed as punishment, but embraced as gift, an opportunity to step out of the constant stream of noise and activity and simply be. The Arctic fox moves through its frozen environment in near total silence, its thick, fur-covered paws making no sound on the snow. This silence is essential to its survival, allowing it to approach prey without detection and to avoid the attention of larger predators. The fox has evolved for this environment, its white coat blending with the snow, its metabolism capable of surviving extreme cold, its movements refined over thousands of generations into a perfection of stealth. Watching an Arctic fox move is like watching silence itself, embodied in fur and motion, a master of the quiet hunt. There is a phenomenon in acoustics called the precedence effect, which describes how the brain processes sounds that arrive at the two ears at slightly different times. This effect helps us locate the sources of sounds, but it also means that our perception of silence is shaped by the spaces we inhabit. A sound made in a reverberant space will be followed by echoes that fill what might otherwise be silence, while a sound made in a dead space will fade quickly, leaving a cleaner quiet behind. Our experience of silence, in other words, is not just about what sounds are present, but about how those sounds behave in the spaces where we hear them. The silence of a church at night, when all the worshipers have gone home and only the altar candles flicker in the darkness, is different from the silence of the same church during the day. At night, the silence seems deeper, more complete, as if the building itself is resting from its duties. The shadows are deeper too, and the familiar architecture takes on a different character, mysterious and ancient. For the night watchman or the cleaning crew, this silence is ordinary, part of the job. But for someone who encounters it unexpectedly, the night silence of a sacred space can feel like an encounter with something beyond the ordinary, a threshold between the human world and something larger. The hibernating bear, curled in its den through the long winter months, exists in a state of profound physiological quiet. Its heartbeat slows to just a few beats per minute. Its breathing becomes shallow and slow. Its body temperature drops to conserve energy. The bear does not eat or drink, does not wake, does not respond to the sounds of the world outside its den. This is the silence of survival, of a body retreating into itself to wait out the harsh season. When spring comes and the bear emerges, it returns to the world of sound and activity. But for those months of winter, it has been as silent as the snow that covers its hiding place. There is a kind of silence that belongs to the experience of swimming underwater. When you submerge your head, the sounds of the world above become muffled and distant, replaced by the strange acoustics of water, your own bubbles, the rush of water past your ears, the muffled boom of waves. This underwater soundscape is alien to us, built for creatures with different hearing systems, and so it can feel like a kind of silence even when it is not truly quiet. The muffled quality of underwater sound has been described by swimmers and divers as restful, as escape, as a momentary release from the constant noise of the air-breathing world. The Japanese concept of ema refers to the space between things, the pause, the gap, the interval. In music, ma is the silence between notes. In architecture, ma is the empty space within a room. In conversation, ma is the pause between speakers, the moment of quiet that allows words to resonate. This concept suggests that emptiness and silence are not merely absences, but presences. Not merely nothing but something. Not merely gaps, but essential elements that give meaning and form to what surrounds them. To appreciate Ma is to appreciate the silence that makes sound meaningful, the space that makes form visible. The silence of a canyon, with its high walls rising on either side, can play tricks with sound. Sounds that enter the canyon may echo back and forth between the walls, creating strange effects, delays, and repetitions that make it difficult to locate the source of a sound. But in the depths of the canyon, in the narrow slot canyons carved by water over millions of years, there can be profound quiet. The walls blocking the sounds of the world outside, creating a natural acoustic sanctuary. These places are often cool and shaded, the sunlight reaching the bottom only briefly, and the silence feels ancient, geological, a quiet that has existed since the canyon was formed. There are languages in the world that use silence as a grammatical element, pauses that carry meaning just as words do. In these languages, the length and placement of silence can change the meaning of an utterance, can indicate respect, uncertainty, disagreement, or contemplation. These linguistic silences are not merely pauses for breath, but intentional choices, part of the grammar that native speakers learn along with words and sounds. Such languages remind us that silence is not universal, not the same across all cultures, but is shaped by the conventions and practices of particular communities. The phenomenon of anechoic experiences, in which all echo is eliminated from a space, can be disorienting for people who are not accustomed to it. We rely on echoes and reverberations more than we realize, using them unconsciously to gauge the size and shape of spaces, to locate ourselves in the world. In an anechoic chamber, these cues are absent, and the result can feel strange, even uncomfortable, as if the world has shrunk to a small bubble around the listener. This discomfort reveals how much we depend on the acoustic environment, how much information we are constantly receiving from the sounds and silences that surround us. The silence of the grave, the final silence from which there is no return, has been a source of meditation and reflection for as long as humans have contemplated death. This silence is different from all others because it is permanent, irreversible, beyond the reach of any waking. Every other silence we experience, we know that sound will return, that the quiet is temporary. But the silence of death is the silence that has no after, that simply is, that stretches forward without limit. Contemplating this silence can be terrifying, but it can also be peaceful, a reminder that rest awaits at the end of all our struggles, that one day we will lay down our burdens and be still. The sound of one's own name, spoken in the midst of chatter and noise, has a peculiar power to cut through and claim our attention. This is known as the cocktail party effect, the ability of the brain to filter the sounds around us and pick out what is relevant. This effect suggests that our perception of silence and sound is not passive but active. Not a simple recording of everything that reaches our ears, but a selective filtering that foregrounds some sounds and backgrounds others. What seems like noise to us may contain patterns we are not attending to, and what seems like silence may contain sounds we have tuned out. Our experience of quiet is as much about our minds as it is about our environments. There is a silence that comes with exhaustion, with the body and mind so depleted that even thought becomes quiet. This is the silence of the end of a long day, of the final moments before sleep claims us. of the settling into rest that happens when we have given everything we have to give. In this state, the usual chatter of the mind fades. The worries and plans and memories that usually fill our thoughts become distant and unimportant, and we sink into a kind of blankness that is not emptiness, but peace. This is the silence toward which you are moving now, as you lie here resting, as your breath slows and your muscles release, as the day recedes and sleep approaches. The formation of pearls inside the soft bodies of oysters and mussels is a process of profound and perfect silence. A grain of sand or some other irritant enters the shell, and the creature responds by coating it with layer upon layer of nacre, the same substance that lines the inside of the shell. Over years, these layers accumulate, building up into the smooth, lustrous spheres we call pearls. All of this happens in darkness and silence, beneath the waters of the sea, without any sound or fanfare. The pearl is a product of quiet patience, of slow accretion, of life responding to discomfort, not with noise or struggle, but with calm, persistent work. The silence between lightning and thunder can be counted to estimate the distance of a storm. Each 5 seconds of silence represents roughly 1 mile of distance between you and the strike. This is because light travels almost instantaneously, while sound moves more slowly, about a mile every 5 seconds. In this silence, in the gap between flash and boom, you can feel the storm approaching, can sense its proximity without hearing it. This is anticipatory silence, silence that carries information, silence that is part of a larger pattern of sound and fury. There are gardens designed specifically for contemplation, with no features intended to entertain or impress, only to provide a quiet space for the mind to rest. These gardens are often simple, with a minimum of plants and features, their design focused on creating an environment of calm. In such a garden, the absence of distraction is the point, the simplicity a deliberate choice. Sitting in such a space, with nothing demanding your attention, you can let your thoughts settle, can sink into a state of quiet awareness that is difficult to achieve in more stimulating environments. The silence of outer space has been the subject of much science fiction, where filmmakers face the choice of how to represent it. Many movies ignore the silence entirely, filling space battles and explosions with dramatic sounds that could not actually exist in a vacuum. But some films have chosen to embrace the silence, to show space as it actually is, quiet and vast and indifferent to human drama. These silent space scenes can be more powerful than any soundtrack, the emptiness itself becoming a kind of message, a reminder of how small we are against the backdrop of the cosmos. There is a phenomenon in nature called the dawn chorus, when birds begin to sing in the hours around sunrise. But before this chorus begins, there is a period of quiet, the last silence of the night before the day's sounds begin. In this silence, the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for the first bird to break the stillness, to signal that another day has come. Once that first song is sung, others follow quickly, and within minutes the air is filled with birdsong. But for those few moments before, there is a silence that feels pregnant with possibility, a pause between night and day, between rest and waking. The ability of snow to absorb sound depends on its structure. Freshly fallen snow, with its delicate crystalline structure and abundant trapped air, is an excellent sound absorber, creating the hushed quiet that follows a snowfall. But as snow ages, as it is compacted by wind or melted and refrozen, it loses this absorptive capacity, Old, packed snow reflects sound rather than absorbing it, and the silence of the fresh snowfall gives way to an ordinary winter soundscape. The ephemeral nature of snow silence makes it all the more precious, a temporary gift that comes with the storm and departs as the snow settles and changes. There are professions built around the cultivation of silence, professions in which the ability to be quiet is an essential skill. The librarian guarding the hush of the reading room, the nurse moving softly through a hospital ward at night, the guard at a meditation retreat. All of these are keepers of quiet, protectors of silence. Their work is often invisible, noticed only when it fails, when the silence is broken and the spell is shattered. But their contribution is real and valuable, creating the conditions in which others can read, rest, and reflect. The silence of a held breath, whether in suspense or in anticipation or in simple stillness, is a focused and intentional quiet. We hold our breath when we are concentrating, when we are waiting for something to happen, when we are trying to be as quiet as possible. This silence is active rather than passive, a deliberate choice to stop the sound of our own breathing, to make ourselves smaller and quieter. Freediving athletes hold their breath for extraordinary lengths of time, descending into the depths of the ocean in a silence broken only by the slow beat of their hearts. This is the silence of presence, of complete attention to the moment. There are rooms in recording studios called isolation booths, designed to separate one sound source from another. These booths are heavily insulated, often with thick walls and floating floors, to prevent sound from entering or escaping. A singer recording a vocal track, for instance, might step into an isolation booth to avoid picking up the sounds of other instruments or the studio environment. Inside these booths, the silence is profound, almost oppressive, designed not for comfort but for acoustic purity. The isolation booth is a functional silence, a quiet created for a purpose, a tool in the service of sound. The practice of walking meditation, common in many Buddhist traditions, involves moving slowly and silently, paying close attention to each step, each breath, each moment of contact between foot and ground. This practice is a way of cultivating silence not through stillness but through movement, finding quiet not in the absence of activity but in the mindfulness with which activity is performed. Walking meditation can be done anywhere, in gardens or corridors or forest paths, and it transforms ordinary movement into a form of contemplation. The silence of walking meditation is not an external quiet, but an internal one, a silencing of the mental chatter that usually accompanies our movements through the world. There is a kind of silence that exists in the spaces between conversations, the moments when talk dies down and people are simply together, not speaking but not uncomfortable. This companionable silence is a mark of intimacy and trust, a sign that the people involved are comfortable enough with each other to let the conversation pause without feeling the need to fill the gap. In this silence, other forms of communication can happen. Glances and smiles, and the simple presence of another person. Words are not always necessary for connection, and the ability to share silence is often a sign of deep relationship. The phenomenon of noise pollution has become a major environmental concern, as the constant sounds of modern life intrude on more and more of the world. Research has shown that noise can harm wildlife, disrupting the communication of birds, the echolocation of bats, the movements of fish. It can also harm human health, contributing to stress, sleep deprivation, and cardiovascular disease. In response, some jurisdictions have created quiet zones, areas where noise is limited, where the sound of nature can be heard without the constant backdrop of engines and machinery. These quiet zones are becoming more valuable as the world grows louder, refugees of silence in an increasingly noisy world. The silence of old-growth forests, those rare patches of forest that have never been logged, is different from the silence of younger woods. The old trees, some of them centuries old, have created a canopy so thick that little sunlight reaches the forest floor, and the understory is relatively open and quiet. The accumulated leaf litter of centuries absorbs sound, and the sheer mass of the trees creates a sense of muffled stillness. In these forests, you can feel the weight of time, the accumulated silence of years upon years of growth and decay, the patient quiet of organisms that have outlasted generations of human beings. There is a type of communication called tacit communication, in which meaning is conveyed not through words, but through silence and context. A parent's meaningful look, a colleague's pregnant pause, a friend's tactful silence, all of these convey information as clearly as any words could. This form of communication depends on shared understanding, on relationships in which people know each other well enough to interpret what is not being said. Tacit communication is the art of speaking without words, of using silence as eloquently as any language. The silence of the desert night, with the stars brilliant overhead and no artificial light for miles, is accompanied by a darkness that seems to have its own quality, its own weight. In this darkness and silence, the senses strain to find something to perceive, and sometimes they find it: a distant animal, a passing breeze, the slow movement of the constellations across the sky. But often they find nothing, just the vast, empty quiet of a landscape that has been here for millions of years, changing slowly in ways that human senses cannot detect. This is the silence of geological time, of a world that cares nothing for human concerns, that will continue long after we are gone. The practice of contemplative prayer, found in many Christian traditions, involves sitting in silence and opening oneself to the presence of the divine. Unlike other forms of prayer that use words and formulas, contemplative prayer is wordless, a simple resting in the quiet, waiting for God without agenda or expectation. Those who practice this form of prayer often describe the silence as full rather than empty, inhabited rather than vacant, a communion that happens beyond the reach of language. The silence of contemplative prayer is not an end in itself, but a means, a way of creating the conditions in which something else can happen. There are sounds that only exist in memory, sounds that were once heard but can never be heard again. The voice of someone who has died, the music of a concert that was never recorded, the particular creak of a staircase in a house that no longer exists. These sounds persist only in the minds of those who heard them, and when those people die, the sounds will vanish entirely from the world. In this sense, every sound is precious, every moment of listening unique and unrepeatable. The silence that follows us through life is constantly filling with sounds that will never come again, an accumulation of acoustic experiences that belong only to us. The quiet of a well-designed hotel room, with its thick carpets and heavy curtains and insulated walls, is a manufactured silence, a product of deliberate choices about materials and construction. Hotel designers understand that guests value quiet, that the ability to rest and sleep is essential to the hospitality experience, and so they invest in soundproofing and acoustic treatment. The result is a room that feels removed from the world, a bubble of quiet in the midst of the city, a place where the sounds of other guests and the traffic outside are reduced to a distant murmur. This commercial silence is a reminder that quiet has value, that it is something people are willing to pay for. The silence of a photograph, mentioned earlier, extends to the silence of all visual art. A painting captures a moment in time but preserves it without sound. The figures in a painting may appear to be speaking, may be shown with open mouths and animated gestures, but they make no sound, have made no sound, will never make sound. They are frozen in an eternal silence, their words and actions suspended forever. This silence of art is not a limitation but a quality, one of the things that distinguishes the visual from the auditory, the permanent from the passing. There is a silence that comes with the ending of music, not just the silence that follows the last note, but the silence that replaces the world of sound that the music had created. When we are deeply immersed in music, it becomes our world, filling our consciousness, carrying us along on its currents. When the music stops, we are returned to the ordinary world, to the ambient sounds of our environment, to the relative quiet of non-musical life. This return can feel like a loss, a diminishment, a stepping down from a heightened state. The silence that follows great music is not ordinary silence, but the echo of transcendence, the memory of what has just been lost. The phenomenon of auditory hallucinations, hearing sounds that are not there, reveals something about the nature of silence and the brain. In conditions of extreme sensory deprivation, when external sound is eliminated, the brain may begin to generate sounds on its own, filling the silence with imagined voices, music, or noise. This suggests that the brain is not designed for true silence, that it expects a certain level of auditory input and will create its own if none is provided. The silence we experience, then, is always a balance between external sound and internal perception, a negotiation between the world and the mind. The silence of a museum at closing time, when the last visitors have left and the guards begin their night rounds, is a particular kind of institutional quiet. The artworks hang in their places, seen now only by cameras and occasional patrols, waiting in darkness for the morning and the return of human attention. This silence is a kind of rest for the art itself, a break from the constant gaze of visitors, a time when the objects can simply be without being observed. Of course, art does not literally need rest, but there is something poignant about imagining it having its own experience of the night, its own relationship with the silence and darkness. The silence between heartbeats is the most constant silence in our lives, a tiny gap of quiet that occurs several times each second, unnoticed and unremarkable but always present. In that gap, the heart pauses, rests, gathers itself for the next contraction. This micro-silence is the rhythm of our lives, the percussion track of our existence, a pattern of sound and silence so constant that we only notice it when something goes wrong. Feeling your own pulse, you can become aware of this silence, this tiny gap between beats, this momentary stillness at the heart of living. The practice of keeping a vigil, watching through the night in silence, has ancient roots in many cultures. Vigils may be kept for the dying, for the dead, for spiritual purposes, or for practical ones. The silence of the vigil is a silence of attention, of presence, of being fully here when one could be asleep. Keeping vigil is a gift of time and awareness, a statement that this moment, this person, this situation matters enough to stay awake for. The silence of the vigil is not empty, but full, not passive, but active, a silence of witnessing and care. There are sounds that exist below the threshold of human hearing, infrasound, and sounds that exist above it, ultrasound, and between these two boundaries lies the narrow band of frequencies that we call sound. Everything outside that band is, for us, silence. But the world is full of these inaudible vibrations produced by natural phenomena and by the technologies we have created. We move through a world of silent sound, of vibrations that pass through us and around us without our knowledge. The silence we experience is thus always partial, always incomplete, a limitation of our senses rather than a quality of the world. The silence of the ocean floor, miles below the surface, is a silence of pressure and darkness and slow time. The creatures that live there move slowly, conserving energy in an environment where food is scarce. Many of them have never seen light, have never heard the sounds of the surface world, have lived their entire lives in a realm of quiet that would be unimaginable to us. When human submersibles descend to these depths, they bring with them the sounds of their engines and instruments, temporary intrusions into a silence that has lasted for eons. The deep ocean is one of the last truly quiet places on Earth, insulated by miles of water from the noise of human activity above. There is a quality of quiet that comes with intense focus when the mind becomes so absorbed in a task that it stops noticing the sounds around it. This is not a silencing of the environment, but a silencing of attention, a withdrawal of consciousness from the auditory world. In states of deep concentration, sounds may reach the ear but not the mind, may be present but not processed. This focused silence is different from relaxed silence, more intense and less comfortable, but it shares with relaxed silence a quality of inner quiet, a cessation of the mental chatter that usually accompanies our waking lives. The silence that exists in the gaps between words, the tiny pauses that separate one word from the next in ordinary speech, is essential to our ability to understand language. Without these gaps, words would run together into an unintelligible stream of sound. But we are so skilled at processing speech that we usually do not notice these pauses, do not attend to the silence that makes language possible. Paying attention to these gaps can be a practice in itself, a way of becoming more aware of the structure of speech, of the rhythm of sound and silence that underlies all communication. There is a silence that comes with the acceptance of something difficult, a settling of the mind that occurs when struggle gives way to surrender. This silence is not defeat but wisdom, not giving up but letting go. It is the silence that follows the realization that some things cannot be changed, that some losses cannot be recovered, that some questions have no answers. This accepting silence is often accompanied by a sense of peace, a release of the tension that comes with fighting against reality. It is a silence of maturity, of experience, of having lived long enough to know that not everything can be fixed. The phenomenon of acoustic shadow, in which an obstacle blocks sound from reaching certain areas, creates pockets of relative quiet even in noisy environments. A building, a hill, a thick stand of trees, any of these can create an acoustic shadow, a space where the sounds of the world are muffled or absent. People have long known intuitively how to find these shadows, how to position themselves to minimize unwanted noise. Modern acoustic design makes deliberate use of this principle, positioning barriers to create quiet zones, to protect sensitive areas from the noise of roads and airports and factories. There is a silence in the heart of a great city that few people ever experience. The silence of the early morning hours in places usually thronging with people. Times Square at 4 in the morning, Piccadilly Circus before dawn, the Champs-Élysées in the hours between the club's closing and the shops opening. These famous places have their own silence, a quiet that feels almost impossible given their usual character. To experience this urban silence is to see the city with different eyes, to realize that the noise we associate with the city is not inherent to it, but is produced by the people who inhabit it, and that when the people withdraw, the silence returns. The quiet of a well-tended garden with its carefully maintained paths and borders, its selected plants and thoughtful arrangements, is a cultivated silence, a quiet that has been designed and maintained by human effort. This is different from the quiet of wilderness, which exists without human intervention, and from the quiet of abandoned places, which exists despite the absence of human care. The garden's silence is a collaboration between human intention and natural growth, a place where the noise of the world is deliberately excluded and the sounds of nature are deliberately included. Sitting in such a garden, you can feel the care that has gone into creating this quiet space. There is a phenomenon in audio called white noise, a type of sound that contains all frequencies at equal intensity. To many people, white noise sounds like a hiss or a rush, similar to the static between radio stations. But white noise has an interesting property. It can mask other sounds, making them less noticeable or less disturbing. Many people use white noise to help them sleep, to cover up the sounds of traffic or neighbors or the city. In this way, a certain kind of sound can create a functional silence, not an absence of sound, but a neutralization of sound, a blank acoustic slate that allows the mind to rest. The silence of a sleeping child, watched over by a parent in the dark, is one of the tenderest silences in human experience. The child's breath rises and falls, perhaps with the occasional sigh or murmur, but otherwise there is quiet, the quiet of complete trust, of total vulnerability, of rest that has no fear. The parent watches, perhaps adjusting a blanket or brushing back a strand of hair, participating in a silence that is more than the absence of sound, that is a communion of love and protection and peace. This silence is a gift that parents give to children, the gift of safety, the gift of undisturbed sleep. There are sounds that we have learned to tune out so completely that we no longer hear them at all. The ticking of a clock, the hum of a refrigerator, the background noise of air conditioning. These sounds are constantly present in many of our environments, but we have learned to ignore them, to treat them as silence even when they are not. This ability to tune out familiar sounds is essential to our sanity, allowing us to focus on what matters without being constantly distracted by background noise. But it also means that our experience of silence is subjective, shaped by what we have learned to hear and what we have learned to ignore. The silence of deep thought, of wrestling with a difficult problem, is an internal quiet that may or may not be accompanied by external quiet. When we are thinking hard, we often withdraw from the auditory world, our attention so focused inward that sounds become mere background. This is the silence of concentration, of effort, of the mind working on something that matters. It can be accompanied by physical stillness or by restless movement, by true quiet or by ambient noise. What matters is not the external environment, but the internal state, the silencing of distraction in service of thought. The quiet of a hospital room at night, with its beeping monitors and periodic interruptions, is not true silence, but it has a quiet quality nonetheless, a hushed atmosphere of rest and healing. The sounds that fill the hospital at night are purposeful sounds, sounds of care and monitoring, sounds that exist to keep people alive. Beneath these sounds, patients sleep the drugged sleep of the ill, a silence of the body that allows healing to happen. The hospital night shift moves through this quiet, checking vital signs and administering medications, the silent heroes of the nocturnal world of care. There is a silence that exists at the heart of all matter, the silence of atoms, the stillness at the center of the electron clouds that make up everything we see and touch. At this scale, the concept of sound ceases to have meaning, for there is no air, no medium for vibration, just the quantum dance of particles too small to imagine. And yet, from this silent foundation, all the sounds of the world arise, the symphony of vibrations that fills our lives, built up from the silence of the infinitely small. When we contemplate this atomic silence, we are contemplating the ground of all existence, the quiet that underlies all noise. As this gentle reflection on silence and quiet places draws toward its close, allow yourself to sink deeper into the stillness that surrounds you. The words that have passed through your awareness are not meant to be remembered, not meant to be retained. They are like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that spread and fade, leaving the water as calm as before. Let these reflections on silence become part of your own silence now, dissolving into the quiet of your mind. The silence of late autumn, when the leaves have fallen and the world is preparing for winter, has a quality of waiting about it. The birds have migrated or fallen quiet, the insects have disappeared, and the trees stand bare against the gray sky. This is not the dead silence of winter, but a transitional quiet, a pause between seasons, a moment when the world is neither fully alive nor fully dormant. Walking through a forest in late autumn, you can feel this silence as a kind of anticipation, a holding of breath before the first snow falls. The quiet of dawn in the mountains, when the first light touches the highest peaks while the valleys below are still in shadow, is a silence divided by light. Above, the snow-capped summits glow pink and gold, silent sentinels greeting the new day. Below, darkness and quiet still reign, the night creatures returning to their dens, the day creatures not yet stirring. In between, there is a zone of transition, a borderland where light meets shadow, and the silence of night gives way to the sounds of day. This dawn quiet is brief but beautiful, a daily miracle that most of us sleep through. There are moments in life when words feel inadequate, when the only appropriate response is silence. The birth of a child, the death of a friend, the sight of something so beautiful it stops the breath. These are moments when language fails, when the chattering mind falls silent, when we are simply present to what is. These silences are not empty but overflowing, full of emotion and meaning that words could never capture. They are the silences that matter most, the quiet at the heart of our most profound experiences. The silence of forgiveness, when anger finally lets go and peace takes its place, is a healing silence. This is not the cold silence of refusal to speak, but a warm quiet of reconciliation, of wounds beginning to heal, of relationships mending. Forgiveness does not require words, though words may come later. It begins in silence, in the letting go of grievance, in the willingness to be present to another person without the burden of the past. This silence of forgiveness is one of the most difficult to achieve, but also one of the most liberating. There is a particular quiet that exists in places of great natural beauty, a silence that seems to be part of the landscape itself. Standing before a vast canyon or a towering waterfall, facing the ocean at sunset or a mountain meadow in bloom, we often fall silent, our words seeming small and unnecessary in the presence of such grandeur. This is the silence of awe, the quiet that comes when we encounter something larger than ourselves, something that puts our lives in perspective and reminds us of our place in the great scheme of things. Your body is heavy and warm, settled into the surface that holds you. Your breath moves slowly, in and out, like a tide that has no need to hurry. The thoughts that have been drifting through your consciousness are beginning to fade, losing their edges, becoming softer and less distinct. This is how sleep approaches, not with fanfare or announcement, but with a gradual dimming, a slow retreat of the waking mind. There is no need to remember anything from these gentle words, no need to carry any fact or image into your dreams. The purpose of these reflections was not to inform, but to soothe, not to fill your mind, but to empty it, not to stimulate, but to calm. Whatever you have heard or half heard, whatever has reached your awareness or passed it by, all of it is now releasing, letting go, drifting away like leaves on a slow river. The silence that you have been contemplating is becoming your silence now, the quiet of the deserts and the depths, the hush of snow-covered fields and sleeping forests, the stillness of space and the peace of empty rooms. All of these are present in you now, part of the quiet into which you are sinking. You are joining the great silence that underlies all things, the rest that awaits at the end of every day. Let your eyes remain closed, or let them close if they are not already. Let your breath find its own rhythm, neither controlled nor hurried. Let your muscles release whatever tension they still hold, melting into the softness beneath you. There is nothing to do now but rest, nothing to think about, nothing to remember or plan or worry over. Everything can wait until morning. Everything will still be there when you wake. For now, there is only this stillness, this quiet, this peace. The night stretches ahead of you, full of hours of rest, full of time for the body to heal and the mind to dream. You do not need to track these hours, do not need to be aware of time passing. Sleep will carry you through the darkness, as it has carried every creature that has ever lived. You are part of a great rhythm now, the rhythm of day and night, of waking and sleeping, of sound and silence. And now it is time for silence, for rest, for the peaceful oblivion of sleep. There is nothing more to say, nothing more to hear. Only the quiet remains, deep and soft and welcoming. Let it enfold you. Let it hold you. Let it carry you down into the stillness where dreams begin. Rest now. Rest in the silence. Rest